pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3, bishop to b4, queen to c2, king to g8, pawn to a3, bishop to c3, queen to c3, pawn to d5, bishop to g5, pawn to c4, queen to c4, pawn to b6, rook to d1, bishop to a6, queen to a4, pawn to h6, bishop to h4, queen to d7, queen to c2, queen to c6, queen to c6, knight to c6, bishop to f6, pawn to f6, pawn to e3, bishop to f1, king to f1, knight to a5, knight to f3, knight to c4, rook to b1, pawn to c5, king to e2, rook to c8, rook to c1, knight to d6, pawn to c5, pawn to c5, rook to c2, king to f8, knight to d2, pawn to c4, rook to c1, rook to b8, king to f3, pawn to c3, pawn to c3, rook to c5, pawn to c4, pawn to f5, king to e2, king to e7, king to d3, king to d7, rook to c3, rook to c6, pawn to c5, knight to e8, knight to f3, rook to a6, knight to e5, king to e7, king to e2, knight to f6, rook to c2, knight to d5, rook to d3, rook to c8, rook to b3, rook to c7, rook to c4, rook to a5, knight to d3, pawn to e5, knight to e5, rook to c5, rook to c5, rook to c5, rook to b7, king to e6, knight to f7, rook to a5, knight to d8, king to d6, rook to b3, rook to a6, knight to f7, king to c5, knight to e5, pawn to h5, king to d2, pawn to h4, knight to d3, king to c4, king to c2, rook to d6, knight to f4,